Chapter 18. Nauvoo. There are more bends in the Mississippi than even a river rat can remember, with every spring flood erasing some of the old and creating a score of new. But the bend that the Mormons made famous is likely to be as permanent a landmark as any on this fabulous river's course. It lies halfway down the state of Illinois, not far north of and across the river from Keokuk in Iowa. The river bank rises gently here to a point so high that one standing on its summit can see the river cutting a great silver semicircle at one's feet. When Joseph Smith stood on this hill after his escape from Missouri in 1839, the spot was wooded and trackless and swamps covered the lowlands behind him, but he could see the glistening river with its islands lying to the north like lush garden places, and the green Iowa hills beyond. "It is a beautiful sight," he said fervently, "and it shall be called Nauvoo, which means in Hebrew a beautiful plantation." Nauvoo had the melancholy music of a mourning dove's call and somehow matched the magic of the sight. The city saw a growth even more spectacular than it had far west. It was laid out in neat squares, like a checkerboard shaped to fit a hill, with the square on the summit set aside for a temple. Almost at one breath it swallowed up the handful of nearby cabins known as Commerce, whose streets were resurveyed and widened to conform to Joseph's ideal city plan. Within a year after the prophet's coming, Nauvoo boasted 250 houses, with scores more building. The timber had been felled, the swamps drained, and the cornerstones laid for an immense temple. Neatly fenced farms fanned out from the city across what had been scrub woods and marsh. The year took a grievous toll of life. Weakened by a winter of hunger and exposure, the saints fell easy victim to an epidemic of ague, perhaps typhoid or malaria, and died like flies in the frost. Joseph and Emma gave up their house to the sick and lived in a tent. Emma, who had considerable fame as an herb doctor, went among the stricken administering Sappington's pills, Dover's powders, and various of her own medicines, although she had not yet fully recovered from the birth of a new son, Don Carlos. Cries for Joseph's prayers were so insistent that at the height of the epidemic he spent most of his days making the rounds of the sick. Usually his mere presence was enough to bring some relief, and occasionally he made spectacular healings. Parley Pratt walked with him one day to the home of Elijah Fordham, who lay swathed in poultices and almost unconscious. "His eyes were sunk in their sockets," Pratt wrote in his autobiography. "His flesh was gone, and the paleness of death was upon him." "Do you have enough faith to be healed?" Joseph asked him. "I fear it is too late," Fordham replied weakly. "If you had come sooner, I think I would have been healed." Taking him by the hand, the prophet cried out in a voice that shook the house, "In the name of Jesus Christ, arise and walk." Whereupon, said Pratt, the man leaped from his bed, shook off the poultices and bandages from his feet, put on his clothes so quick that none had got a chance to assist him, and taking a cup of tea and a little refreshment, he walked with us from house to house visiting other sick beds. Joseph described no healings in his journal. For every success there were too many failures, and he could not reproach his people with lack of faith. Eventually the pestilence spent itself, and with the passing of years the stories of Joseph's healings multiplied. It was said that when he was worn out with praying for the sick, he gave his handkerchief to Wilford Woodruff and told him to wipe the faces of the stricken children, who were thereby saved in scores. Before another year had passed, sickness made its first inroads upon the Smith family. First Joseph's father died, then his younger brother Don Carlos, and finally his newest son, who had been named Don Carlos after his uncle. Despite these sorrows, Joseph was planning with undiminished vigor. There was an urgency in his exhortations which had a deeper cause than a mere release from the stifling inactivity of Liberty Jail. Joseph had come too close to death ever again to live in easy security. He knew now that persecution was as inevitable as the sunrise, and that to it the only answer was power. He intended to make of his church a political force that would command deference and a military force that would maintain peace. Since he could have neither political nor military power without numbers, he pushed the missionary campaign with a strenuousness that dismayed the sick and poverty-ridden. The 12 apostles had been ordered off to Europe in the summer of 1839, though their cabins were unfinished, and several were ill with ague. Brigham Young, gaunt and suffering, had taken leave of his destitute family and started off without strength or money. No one but Joseph could have persuaded him to leave under such wretched circumstances. With prodigious exertion he had brought the saints out of Missouri and had labored the whole winter to keep them from starving. They had learned to run to him for counsel and had obeyed him implicitly even after Rigdon's arrival. Although Brigham Young was born to command men, he had not tasted the sweetness of such power before and was loath to relinquish it. Joseph, however, had been eager to recover the prestige and authority that was his in far west palmy days. He had seized the reins and held them. Rigdon, feeble and emaciated from his months in jail and prey to every chill and fever that swept through Nauvoo, had been no rival. The prophet predicted that Nauvoo would soon become the biggest city west of the Appalachians. Although it was above some river rapids which prevented the largest steamers from going north of Warsaw, he planned to remedy this by building a wing dam in the Mississippi, which would also make an ideal harbor and furnish water power for the Nauvoo industry. Until it could be built, he decided to have a Mormon port in Warren, just south of Warsaw, which could be easily connected with Nauvoo by rail. Warsaw was jealous of the phenomenal Mormon city, fearful lest the new sect snatch all the political offices of Hancock County and rob her of her trade. Mormon occupation of Warren was a grave threat to Warsaw's prosperity, since the Warsaw harbor was filling up with sandbars, and Warren provided the nearest landing place. When the editor of the Warsaw newspaper learned the Mormon purchases in the vicinity, he wrote, "We sincerely hope this curse will be spared us." The Warsaw paper, however, was the only unfriendly one in Illinois. The press all over the country was sympathizing with the Saints, for Joseph, resolving to make Missouri a byword for oppression and Boggs a synonym for tyranny, saw to it that the sufferings of his people received national publicity. The new Mormon paper, Times and Seasons, published eyewitness stories of the Hansville massacre and exhaustive accounts of the expulsion, and copies were sent to all the leading American newspapers. Noting the success of this publicity, the editor of the Chicago Democrat wrote sagely, "We will not go so far as to call the Mormons martyr-mongers, but we believe they are men of sufficient sagacity to profit by anything in the shape of persecution. The Mormons have greatly profited by their persecution in Missouri. Let Illinois repeat the bloody tragedies of Missouri, and one or two other states follow, and the Mormon religion will not only be known throughout our land, but will be very extensively embraced." Determined to secure justice, Joseph started for Washington in November 1839, armed with hundreds of affidavits and petitions. "It will be a long and lonesome time during my absence from you," he wrote to Emma, "but shall I see so many perish and not seek redress? So I will try this once in the name of the Lord." In Washington he ran headlong into the most delicate and dangerous of all problems perplexing the American government, the issue of states' rights, which eventually he came to call a stink in the nostrils of the Almighty. The southern states were pathologically jealous of their sovereignty, and the balance between slave state and free hung by so fragile a thread that the boldest statesmen dared not tamper with it. When Joseph called on President Van Buren, he was met with complete candor on this point. "I can do nothing for you. If I do anything, I shall come in contact with the whole state of Missouri." Van Buren expressed sympathy, however, as did the members of Congress whom the prophet interviewed, and promised to consider his case. But it soon became evident that with the presidential election in the offing, new politicians, and particularly few Democrats, wanted to antagonize Missouri. Joseph wrote back bitterly to Nauvoo that the ruling principles in Washington were personal aggrandizement and popular clamor. Pending the decision of the Senate Judiciary Committee, to whom the Mormon petitions were given, he went to Philadelphia to consult with Parley Pratt, leaving the details in the hands of his able lawyer, Elias Higbee. Meanwhile, the congressmen from Missouri, alarmed by Mormon demands for $2 million in damages, began feverishly talking in their own behalf. Boggs sent to Washington a transcript of the damaging testimony given at Joseph's trial in Richmond. This provided sufficient excuse for the Judiciary Committee to forget Boggs' exterminating order and the Hahn Mills massacre. Eventually, Higbee was informed that redress must be sought in the Missouri courts. Henry Clay and John T. Stewart, Whig senator from Illinois, tried to win a hearing for the Mormon petitions on the floor of Congress, but were voted down. When Joseph returned to Washington and once more appealed to Van Buren, the president replied with a phrase that typified the attitude of every American president from Van Buren to Lincoln when faced with an injustice that touched on slavery. "Sir, your cause is just, but I can do nothing for you." Isaac Galland had set out to milk the Mormons dry. After getting properly baptized, he wormed his way into Joseph's confidence and became his chief land agent. Joseph had already purchased from him $18,000 worth of land in and about Nauvoo, giving him a Mormon-owned Missouri land in payment. He had also exchanged Missouri land for $80,000 worth of Galland's half-breed lands in Iowa. Galland's title to the Nauvoo tract was genuine, but his deeds to the Iowa territory were all forged. Months passed before Galland's perfidy came to light. During this time, he negotiated the purchase of 2 farms from Hugh and William White, costing $9,000, and an expensive 500-acre tract from the Hotchkiss Syndicate, costing $53,000. Notes for this property were signed by Joseph, Hiram, and Sidney Rigdon. Joseph was in absolute control of all land sales to his people. The High Council voted him treasurer of the church, and then bestowed the title of trustee in trust, with power to receive, acquire, manage, or convey property, real, personal, or mixed, for the sole use and benefit of said church. Eventually, he also became registrar of deeds, from which position he could lay his thumb on any clandestine sales. He fixed the average price of the Nauvoo city lot at $500. To those who had been invalided from wounds received in Missouri, he gave lots free. The attractive Sarah Cleveland, who with her husband had befriended him on his trip from Missouri to Illinois, was given a lot on the river directly across the street from his own, which fronted on the Mississippi at its most picturesque point. To pay for the vast acreages he had contracted to buy, the prophet devised an ingenious system of land exchange. New converts in the East were advised to turn over their property to the church through his agents, Isaac Galland and William Smith, who had once more been forgiven and reinstated as an apostle. These agents in return gave orders on land in and about Nauvoo. The eastern property was then either sold outright or transferred to the Hotchkiss Syndicate in payment of the $53,000 debt. The system had a bad defect in the high interest rate on loans, which on the Hotchkiss purchase amounted to $6,000 in 2 years. To meet the interest, Joseph had to make considerable profit on the land he sold to his own people. As a result, the rumor that he was enriching himself on the spoils of the brethren gained such proportions that it had to be officially denied in a church conference. When Galland went east to pay the interests to Hotchkiss and arrange for deeding eastern lands to cover the whole debt, he absconded with the money. Joseph revoked his agency and sent out agents to catch up with him, writing to Hotchkiss in despair, "Why he has not done according to my instructions, God only knows." Eventually the man came back to Nauvoo and made some kind of restitution, but the damage inflicted on the land exchange system was irreparable. The full measure of Galland's double-dealing was not felt, however, till late in 1841, when the whole tangled litigation concerning the half-breed tract was finally straightened out and his deeds proved worthless in the courts. Men who had escaped from Missouri and had gone to Iowa with some little means were now reduced to beggary. A year's labor had been lost, and most of the 250 families that had settled across the river came back penniless to Nauvoo. Joseph continually urged the industrialization of his city. Newcomers from the East and from England were told to put their capital into mills instead of land, and Joseph set up the Nauvoo Agricultural and Manufacturing Association with a capital stock of $100,000 to coordinate all Mormon economic activity. Within 2 years, the city had 2 big steam sawmills, a steam flour mill, a tool factory, and a foundry. Plans were laid for a Chinaware factory, to be manned by English converts from the Staffordshire potteries. Farmer converts who had no money for land were allowed to raise crops on a huge community farm just outside Nauvoo. Laborers and skilled craftsmen who lacked employment worked on the temple. Although their pay was uncertain and consisted of donated food and clothing, work on the huge structure was always a labor of love. All Nauvoo men were expected to spend each 10th day working there or else to give the equivalent in goods or money. One group was sent up the Mississippi to the Wisconsin pineries, where they spent several winters cutting timber for the Lord's house. Joseph's autarkic control was not, however, taken completely for granted. A city ordinance forbidding anyone to set up a business in Nauvoo without a license from the city council, which the prophet dominated, aroused so much resentment that it was repealed in May 1842. But Joseph himself felt that in matters of business as well as the spirit, he was answerable to no one. In January 1841, he presented to the church a revelation from God ordering the saints to build a hotel. The extraordinarily mundane details of this commandment seem not to have troubled his people. "And they shall not receive less than $50 for a share of stock in that house, and they shall be permitted to receive $15,000 from any one man for stock in that house, but they shall not be permitted to receive over $15,000 from any one man. And if they do appropriate any portion of that stock anywhere else, only in that house, without the consent of the stockholder, and do not repay fourfold for the stock which they appropriate anywhere else, only in that house, they shall be accursed, and shall be moved out of their place, saith the Lord God, for I, the Lord, am God, and cannot be mocked in any of these things." The revelation then went on guilelessly to grant Joseph a suite of rooms in the hotel for himself and his posterity from generation to generation, forever and ever. Joseph had somehow succeeded in welding 2 antithetical principles. He had come to identify the goodness of God with the making of money, and had succeeded in making the union palatable to his saints. Embedded in Joseph's character was the commonplace Yankee mixture of piety and avarice, but this seed he developed to a special flowering. The true mystic is preoccupied with things of the spirit, and insofar as he concerns himself with worldly affairs, he denies his calling. But in Joseph's revelations, lessons on the nature of God and guidance for the operation of a boarding house sit side by side, like Hyperion and the Satyr, enthroned in equal majesty. The Mormon apostles who went to England had seen America's worst panic and thought they knew something about the poverty attendant upon economic depression. But in England they found, in addition to financial chaos and unemployment, the appalling housing of the urban slums and a fearful burden of taxes weighing on the thin shoulders of the poor. The hated Corn Laws were still in force, stifling trade and doubling the cost of bread. Thousands of workers were crowded into squat tenements, built without water or sewers, and almost without windows. Sporadic strikes were suppressed with vicious cruelty, and the reform movement known as Chartism was looked upon as the dread specter of revolution. George A. Smith wrote back to Nauvoo, "I have seen more beggars here in one day than I saw all my life in America." Shocked by what they had found, the Mormon elders began to preach the glory of America along with the glory of the gospel. Brigham Young was convinced that emigration was the only solution for Europe's overpopulation, and made this the theme of many of his sermons. Soon the missionaries were publishing in Liverpool a little journal called the Millennial Star, which frequently had the ring of a real estate agency propaganda pamphlet. "Living in America is about 1/8 of what it costs in this country. Millions on millions of acres of land lie before them unoccupied, with a soil as rich as Eden, and a surface as smooth, clear, and ready for the plow as the park scenery of England. Instead of a lonely swamp or dense forest filled with savages, wild beasts and serpents, large cities and villages are springing up in their midst, with schools, colleges, and temples, there being abundant room for more than 100 millions of inhabitants." Before long, the apostles were converting Englishmen in thousands. Their success loosed a deluge of anti-Mormon pamphlets. Even the sophisticated London Athenaeum took note of the new sect. "Mormonism is making rapid progress," it pointed out on April 3, 1841, "particularly in the manufacturing districts, and it is also spreading in Wales. Furthermore, its converts are not made from the lowest ranks. Those sought and obtained by the Mormonite apostles are mechanics and tradesmen who have saved a little money, who are remarkable for their moral character, but are exposed to the delusion from having, as Archbishop Sharp expressed it, studied the Bible with an ill-balanced mind." Only London was deaf to the call of Zion. Heber Kimball worked there for weeks before he washed its dust from his heels and consigned it to the devil. "We found the whole city given to covetousness," he wrote home, "and all doors closed against us. We did not hesitate to stand in the midst of the streets and, Jonah-like, cry repentance unto the inhabitants, who are ripening in iniquity and preparing for the wrath of God, and like the ox going to the slaughter, know not the day of their visitation." 200 converts left England for Nauvoo in 1840. In 1841, the number jumped to 1,200, and the following year to 1,600. They had rather be slaves in America than starve in this country," wrote Parley Pratt. "I cannot keep them back." By 1844, there were at least 8,000 more clamoring to leave. Few apostles remained in Britain more than a year, but before they left their work in the hands of lesser men, they had organized an emigration system which became so well known for its honesty and efficiency that it was cited in the House of Commons as a model for other companies to follow. The Mormons set up an office, chartered their own ships, organized the emigrants so that there would be ample food and water, and charged less than £4 for the journey all the way to New Orleans. Much of the credit for the success of the emigration system was due Brigham Young, whose business head was one of the soundest in the church. He had been one of the first apostles to return to Nauvoo, and it was from there that he directed the missionary enterprise. And within a month after his return, he had persuaded the prophet to shift all the business affairs of the church from the high council over to the apostles. Joseph, however, still retained the ultimate authority in financial matters. It was a long time before Young succeeded in straightening out Nauvoo's chaotic finances, for Joseph's investments too often returned nothing. Although many rich converts trusted the prophet with their fortunes, still he remained in debt. In the spring of 1841, he cataloged a list of his outstanding liabilities and found them to total over $70,000, in addition to another $33,000 carried over from the Kirtland days. It is not surprising, therefore, that he looked with interest upon the bankruptcy law that Congress passed in 1841 to relieve the straits of the debtor class. No one in Washington, apparently, had any foresight as to the fabulous popularity of this bankruptcy law. In the brief period of its operation, 440 millions of liabilities were wiped out for 44 millions of assets. When Congress went back into session, it repealed the law in haste, but in the meantime the Mormon prophet, together with his brothers Hiram and Samuel, and a host of leading Mormon dignitaries, had joined the stampede. It was an evil day in the summer of 1840, some months after his return from Washington, that Joseph baptized into the church Dr. John Cook Bennett. He had been an instructor in midwifery in an obscure Ohio college, and was now secretary of the Illinois Medical Society and quartermaster general of the Illinois militia. He was 35, the same age as the prophet, but his short, dapper figure and dark complexion were in striking contrast with Joseph's blond and careless magnificence. Emma distrusted Bennett's easy, vivacious manner and facile tongue from the beginning, whereas Joseph was immediately attracted. Before coming to Nauvoo, Bennett had written the prophet a barrage of letters proclaiming his own special virtues with the kind of extravagant rhetoric that most easily blinded Joseph to a man's true character. The prophet had drawn up a series of charters incorporating the city of Nauvoo, providing for a university, and calling for the organization of a militia body to be called the Nauvoo Legion. The city charter gave the Nauvoo City Council power to make, ordain, establish, and execute all such ordinances not repugnant to the Constitution of the United States or of this state, an ingenious wording which Joseph later interpreted in the widest possible sense. The Nauvoo Legion was to be technically a part of the state militia, but actually an autonomous military body whose commander would be answerable only to the governor. Bennett vowed he would push these charters through the Illinois legislature. The Mormons at the moment were in a strategic position for bargaining for legislative favor. Soured on the Democratic Party by Van Buren's indifference, they had voted the straight Whig ticket in the election of November 1840, except for one candidate. In order to give their votes to a Democrat, James H. Ralston, who had done the prophet some favors, they scratched the name which happened to be last on the Whig list. The spurned candidate was an obscure young politician named Abraham Lincoln. Despite this demonstration of Whig preference, Joseph Smith made it clear that his people would join neither party, but would hold themselves free to vote according to the services rendered. As a result, the legislative session of 1840-1841 saw each party stumbling over the other in its frantic efforts to win the Mormon vote, which by now counted heavily in the balance of Illinois politics. Bennett introduced himself to the leaders of both parties, and cozened them equally with promises of Mormon favor. The charters were rushed through both the houses and passed by a voice vote without ever being read, except by title. Bennett wrote back exultingly to the prophet, "Every power we asked has been granted, every request gratified, every desire fulfilled." Even Lincoln, he said, had the magnanimity to vote for our act, and came forward, and after the final vote to the bar of the house, and cordially congratulated me on its passage. The winning of the Nauvoo charters was Joseph's first great political victory, and it made him feel immeasurably obligated to Bennett. It is therefore not surprising that when ugly rumors of the man's debauchery and profligacy caught up with him in Nauvoo, Joseph hastily dismissed them. When Hiram learned on a trip east that Bennett had deserted a wife and 2 children that had been expelled from the Masonic Lodge for unprincipled conduct, he wrote of it to Joseph, but the prophet filed the letter in his drawer. Less than 1 year after his coming to Nauvoo, Bennett had become assistant president of the church. Rigdon had never been deposed as first counselor, but he had been practically bedridden since his release from jail, and Bennett assumed all his duties. In addition, Bennett became mayor of the city, chancellor of the University of Nauvoo, and brigadier general of the Nauvoo Legion, second in command to Joseph. In a revelation the Lord pronounced him blessed. "I have seen the work which he hath done, which I accept if he continue, and will crown him with blessings and great glory." Bennett was Joseph's most intimate friend and counselor for a year and a half. Although during this period Nauvoo was fast becoming the most notorious city in Illinois, outwardly it was a model of propriety. There was not a saloon in the city, and if a man wanted to drink, he had to buy his whiskey from a shop specially licensed by the mayor and take it home with him. "If you want to retire from the noise of the bacchanalian song," said the Times and Seasons, "the midnight broils and the scenes of drunkenness which disgrace so many of our cities and villages, come to Nauvoo. No such proceedings are allowed." For a time the city did have a brothel, which stood but a square away from the temple, using a grocery store as a front. But when urchins scrawled witticisms over its rough boards and an unfriendly editor in Montrose, Iowa, slyly accused the prophet of abetting the lonely wreck of folly, the Nauvoo City Council pronounced it a nuisance. Over the protests, it was said, of the worldly John C. Bennett, and a deputation of the Legion tipped it backwards over the edge of a gully, where it went crashing to the bottom. Nauvoo's self-righteous holiness did not endear her to her sister cities. They resented the pious-speaking city council, which would pass an ordinance threatening vagrants, idle persons, and those who could not give a good account of themselves, with a $500 fine and 6 months jail sentence merely for indulgence in profane or indecent language. Did a sect have the right to impose its own standards on the casual visitor, they asked? Or was not this ordinance a device to keep non-Mormons out of the city? What were these saints so anxious to hide? The epithet community of wives came more and more to be applied to the Holy City. So prominent an organ as the New York Herald on May 16, 1842, reported the rumor that in Nauvoo men and women connected in promiscuous intercourse without regard to the holy bonds of matrimony. The lone Presbyterian minister in Hancock County wrote to a fellow pastor on May 3, 1842, "I presume Nauvoo is as perfect a sink of debauchery and every species of abomination as ever were Sodom or Nineveh." Stories of thievery, from whatever source, were pinned upon the Mormons by the outlying communities, and it became common gossip that Joseph himself sanctioned milking the Gentiles. The latter rumor the prophet combated strenuously. Hancock County had always been a hideout for the river pirates, and a few of these doubtful citizens joined the Mormons, expecting to find shelter from the law in the church's bosom. Joseph excommunicated as many as he could catch and denounced the use of his name as a shield for their infamy. Few thoughtful persons believed that Nauvoo was either a den of debauchery or a hideout for Mississippi outlaws. James Gordon Bennett, the urbane editor of the New York Herald, though not shy about printing salacious insinuations concerning the city, was always careful to print Mormon denials alongside, and in his editorials usually sided with the Mormon point of view. This Bennett took a particular interest in Joseph Smith and gave him extraordinarily good publicity. Said one editorial on January 19, 1842, "Here is a new prophet, starting into existence in the green valleys and lovely little hills of the town of Manchester in Ontario County, New York, leaving New York as Moses left Egypt, wandering over the wild prairies of the West as the great Jewish lawgiver wandered over the wilderness of Zion, and ultimately establishing a holy city and a new religious empire on the Mississippi that numbers 10,000 persons in the city and 30,000 beyond its limits, with a splendid temple for public worship and a military organization of 1,500 pretty well-disciplined troops. This presents a germ of religious civilization, novel, affecting, inviting, wonderful, and extraordinary. All the priests and philosophers of the day may take a lesson from Joe Smith, who seems to have hit the nail exactly on the head by uniting faith and practice, fancy and fact, religion and philosophy, heaven and earth, so as to form the germ of a new religious civilization, bound together in love and temperance, in industry and energy, that may revolutionize the whole earth one of these days. Joe Smith is evidently no fool. He knows what he's about. Go ahead, old boy." Few visitors to Nauvoo had either the New York editor's perception or his imagination, or had any idea of the potentialities of the Mormon movement, but many of them were troubled by the unmistakable military atmosphere that pervaded the city. Every village in the state had its militia group, which paraded on muster days in a carelessly impromptu fashion and made a beeline for the tavern when the dusty marching was over. The Nauvoo Legion, however, looked upon itself as the army of the Lord, drilled regularly and strenuously, and boasted smartly uniformed officers. Every able-bodied man between 18 and 45 was compelled to join, and heavy fines were imposed for failure to appear at parade. By January 1842, the Legion had a complement of 2,000 men. John Cook Bennett used his position as Quartermaster General of the Illinois Militia to secure 3 pieces of cannon and about 250 stand of small arms, which alarmed Gentile rumors increased to 30 pieces of cannon and some 5,000 or 6,000 muskets. Bennett took care to organize the Legion as a corps of riflemen, whereas the older units in the state were armed chiefly with swords and muskets. Fancying himself as a peerless strategist, he was never so pleased as when he was likened to Napoleon. Joseph requested, and received, from Governor Carlin the commission of lieutenant general, and thereafter frequently jested about his outranking every military officer in the United States. He came to prefer the title general, even to president, and used it in much of his correspondence. His uniform was smartly designed, a blue coat with a plentiful supply of gold braid, buff trousers, high military boots, and a handsome chapeau topped with ostrich feathers. On his hip he carried a sword and 2 big horse pistols. Delighting in the pomp and splendor of parades, he called out the Legion on every possible occasion, marching at the head of his magnificent black stallion Charlie. The military spirit infected all the boys in Nauvoo, and Joseph, with his eye ever on the future, soon had them organized into a military corps of their own. Between 400 and 600 paraded and drilled with as much zest as their fathers. Joseph's eldest son, who was a member of the boys' army, took part on the memorable occasion when they decided to invade Nauvoo. The Legion, prepared to give the boys a good scare, lined up to meet them. The men did not know that the youthful corps had raided their mothers' kitchens for every available pot and pan in the city, and when the boys charged out of the woods, beating on the kettles and shrieking, the Legion horses went into a panic and refused to charge. Finally, the prophet, who was watching the scene mounted on the imperturbable Charlie, spurred the big stallion forward squarely into the oncoming boys. They scattered nimbly, the invasion repelled, and the prophet became the hero of the day. The Legion was no mere toy to gratify Joseph's love of pageantry. It was first of all a bulwark against Missouri, for legally the prophet was still a fugitive from justice and could expect writs to be served on him without warning. As time wore on and the rumors of the coming of Missouri sheriffs trickled persistently into Nauvoo, Joseph came to fear extradition more than anything else in the world. In mid-September 1840, the first sheriff materialized, bearing a writ for Joseph from Governor Reynolds of Missouri, reinforced by a demand from the Illinois governor, Thomas Carlin. When Joseph learned of the sheriff's approach, he immediately went into hiding. The sheriff returned the writ to Carlin and made no further effort to catch his prey. Thereafter, Joseph appointed a bodyguard of 12 men, his toughest fighters and most devoted friends. Among them were Porter Rockwell, William Hickman, Hosea Stout, Jonathan Holmes, and John D. Lee. The bodyguard, dressed in white uniforms, made a pretty sight marching and wheeling about the uniformed figure of their chief in Legion parades. Apparently this group was the sole remnant of the Danite band, though not all the bodyguard had been Danites in Missouri. Lee, who called himself the 7th Danite, was appointed to guard Joseph's home. "It was my duty to do as I was ordered," he wrote in his autobiography, "and not ask questions." 8 months after the coming of the first sheriff from Missouri, a second one appeared, supported by a posse. They intercepted Joseph when he was returning unescorted to Nauvoo after a visit with Governor Carlin, who apparently knew and approved the plan in advance. The seizure was a virtual kidnapping. Not until he was carried into Quincy, the last town between him and Missouri Dungeon, was he able to obtain a writ of habeas corpus. This respite was enough to save him. Stephen A. Douglas, judge of the Illinois Supreme Court, who happened to be in Quincy, offered to test the validity of the Missouri writ in nearby Monmouth. Then 3 prominent Whig lawyers, who suspected Douglas's motive to be largely political, since he was nominal head of the Illinois Democratic Party, rushed to Monmouth for the privilege of defending the prophet. With both political parties behind him, Joseph had little to fear. Douglas freed him on a technicality, decreeing that the writ was dead since it had been returned to the governor in September 1840. He refused to judge the case on its merits, there being no precedent to guide him on the issue of extradition, which involved, he said, "great and important considerations relative to the future conduct of the different states." Joseph was free, but he was still a fugitive and could never be certain that the whole process would not one day be repeated, with the judge deciding against him. To meet this day, he planned to have an army in reserve. John C. Bennett, however, looked upon the Legion with a much more aggressive imagination. In Times and Seasons, he published a series of articles under the pseudonym Joab, General in Israel, which made it clear that the Mormon Church was now a power capable of avenging the wrongs inflicted upon it, by the sword if need be. At first, Bennett's column was largely allegory and bombast, but it evolved into a hard-knuckled challenge to Missouri for restitution of Mormon property. "The blood of murdered Mormons cries aloud for help, and the restoration of the inheritance of the saints, and God has heard the cry. And if the moral battle must be fought, and the victory won, he who answers by fire will cause sword and flame to do their office, and again make the Constitution and laws paramount to every other consideration. And I swear by the Lord God of Israel, that the sword shall not depart from my thigh, nor the buckler from my arm, until the trust is consummated, and the hydra-headed fiery dragon slain." Bennett's columns enraged the Gentiles and gave substance to the spreading idea that the Mormons intended to recapture their lost property by the sword. By accident or design, a United States artillery officer witnessed a full-dress parade of the Legion of Nauvoo on May 7, 1842. To the New York Herald, which published his article on June 17th, he wrote excitedly, "What does all this mean? Why this exact discipline of the Mormon Corps? Do they intend to conquer Missouri, Illinois, Mexico? It is true they are part of the militia of the state of Illinois by the charter of their legion, but then there are no troops in the states like them in point of enthusiasm and warlike aspect, yea, warlike character. Before many years this legion will be at 20 and perhaps 50,000 strong, and still augmenting, a fearful host, filled with religious enthusiasm, and led on by the ambitious and talented officers. What may not be effected by them? Perhaps the subversion of the Constitution of the United States, and if this should be considered too great a task, foreign conquest will certainly follow. Mexico will fall into their hands, even if Texas should first take it. I have seen Bennett's plans for the fortification of Nauvoo, which are equal to any of Vauban's. The time will come when this gathering host of religious fanatics will make this country shake to its center. A Western Empire is certain."